Hi guys, so I recently asked on Instagram for your video requests. Not that I don't have a massive list of, quite a lot of videos I'd like to film. I always like to just check in though and see if there's anything that is top priority for you or that I haven't thought of in the past. And multiple people requested to see my favourite translated fiction books, which is a video I've had on my to-do list for ages, top 10 translated books. But seeing so many of you interested in it really pushed me to finally sit down and film it. So that is what this video is. All of the books I'm going to recommend in this video were not originally written into English. I, however, read them in English and I will tell you a little bit more about them as we go through. I thought I would start with my earliest favourite translated fiction series in this instance, and those are of course the Asterix comic book or graphic novels. I started reading Asterix when I was a child. My library had all of the books that were published at the time available to borrow, and I would take them out again, just reread and reread them. Loved them and have continued as new ones have been released over the past few years to pick them up and just adore everything about the Asterix universe. Asterix is a comic book series set in ancient Brittany. It follows the Gauls, an ancient people during the reign of Julius Caesar. Now, Julius Caesar was never actually an emperor of Rome, but I'm not sure if that's quite clear in the graphic novels. I mean, they're not always completely historically accurate, but you can imagine that they're kind of set roughly in the 1st century BC when Julius Caesar was around. You also see various other famous historical figures crop up, like Cleopatra. We travel the world to Egypt, to Germany, to Scotland, all over the place, following these two Gauls on their adventures. The comic books are called Asterix, but they very much follow both Asterix and his best friend Obelix. What's special about these Gauls though is that their village is the last to withstand Roman invasion. They have not yet bowed down to the Romans, and this is because they have a druid who brews a magic potion that gives them sort of superhuman strength, and therefore they're able to stave off the Romans. These books are incredibly hilarious and just fun. They completely captured my imagination as a child. I have continued to do so as I have grown up. They were originally written in French, and although I have gone back and browsed some of them in French with my limited French, I did read all of them originally in English. If we're continuing chronologically though, I think my next favourite translated work that I read was Italo Calvino's Italian folktales, which was naturally originally written in Italian in the mid-20th century. It is essentially like a Grimm's Brothers type collection specifically for Italian folklore. Italo Calvino is an incredibly famous writer. He has a lot of really famous works available in countless languages that usually fit into the literary genre, and Italian folktales is the only one of his I have read, and it seems quite unique in that it is very much a short story collection that are old-fashioned fables. Like I said, I feel like my comparison to the Grimm's Brothers is the most obvious thing I can make that will get across to you what this book is, but I just remember falling in love with this when I was younger and consuming it at a really insane speed. It is quite a chunky book, and I was quite young, maybe like 12 or something when I read it, and I just read it all super quickly. My dad lent it to me when we were on holiday and I loved every second of it. There was just something, again, that completely captured my imagination. It's not a children's book, however, and therefore I think anybody will enjoy it at any age, especially if you're interested in folklore. The rest of these books I read as an adult, so they're all just mished together, but one that I read last year was Convenience Store Woman by Sayaka Murata. This novella was originally written in Japanese, and it just blew me away. I love this book so much. It is about a woman in her mid-30s who works in a Japanese convenience store, and her family just cannot understand why she hasn't pursued a more traditional career path, but instead continues to work part-time in a convenience store. Our main character, however, just does not identify with the same emotions that her family feels. What she wants in life is regularity, rhythm, just something to get her through the day, and she's quite content in her little job. However, the pressure her family are putting on her is getting to her in a sense that it hasn't really rattled her, but she doesn't like it when her family make her feel different, so she just wants to do something to make them think that she is normal according to their standards, and this is what motivates her to do some of the things that she does in this novella. It's quite short, so I don't really want to say any more about the plot, but I will just say that she's such a fascinating character. She's so interesting to follow, such a great narrator, and as somebody who's never been to Japan, I also just found an interesting insight into Japanese culture. But yeah, there was something about this that was just completely compelling and fascinating all the way through. Completely loved it, and although I don't necessarily identify with the protagonist in her experience of emotions, I still found her quite a relatable character, or at least I felt like her character was painted in a convincing way to me as a reader. Another little novella is Down the Rabbit Hole by Juan Pablo Villalobos. This book was originally written in Spanish and is set in Mexico. It's entirely narrated by a young boy of around, say, like 8 or something like that, who is the son of a Mexican drug lord. And he has had quite a unique upbringing in that his father is incredibly powerful, incredibly rich, gives him anything he wants, and because of his father's example, has a slightly distant relationship with the morality, shall we say. What this book does is essentially give us a perspective on this whole situation from a very naive, malleable young mind, and it's so fascinating and kind of weird and kind of funny and kind of dark at the same time. Really loved this book. This was a book that I think I read in the space of a day because I was just so caught up in the story and the narration, and I know not everybody loves a child narrator, but I think it works so well in this context. It is so effective and I really enjoyed reading it. Something a little bit less modern though is Thérèse Racan by Émile Zola. This is a French classic that was originally published in 1867, and I first read this because of the recommendation from my friend Magdalena. It is one of her favourite books, and I can completely see why. As soon as I read a few pages of it, I was mesmerised. Now this is dark. If you like your dark books, this one's for you. The woman is in an unhappy marriage to her cousin. She was raised by her aunt and then married off to her cousin by her aunt when she was old enough, because her aunt just wanted to keep things within the family, I guess, and the business within the family. And she starts up an affair with her husband's friend, and both of these people are incredibly selfish. They love one another, but in the most selfish way, and that selfish love and that selfish desire is what motivates them down a very dark path to do some very dark deeds. I love the depiction of 19th century Paris. I loved like studying the nature of these kind of despicable people, and the writing is equally beautiful, although of course I read it in an English translation. But let's go back to some short stories, and for my next recommendation I wanted to mention There Once Lived a Woman Who Tried to Kill Her Neighbour's Baby, Scary Fairy Tales by Lyudmila Petruskaya, and this is a collection of Russian short stories that came out in the 20th century, and it is very reminiscent of the kind of creepy adult short stories of Roald Dahl. If you enjoy those kind of creepy, scary stories by authors like Roald Dahl, then you will love this. They are so weird. There's often hints of magic realism, and they do that thing that I like in my horror and my creepy books, is that they're told so matter-of-factly, and there's really no emotion poured into the writing, and I really like that because I think it adds to the tone for me as a reader. There's an emotional distance that I think works to make these stories that little bit creepier and that little bit more surreal, and I just love these short stories. I have read other collections of short stories by this author, but this is my favourite one of the ones I've read. I would highly recommend this one in particular, especially if you like anything creepy, surreal, and really well written. But my next one is one that probably comes up on a lot of people's favourite translated fiction list, which is The Vegetarian by Han Kang. This one kind of took the literary world by storm when it was translated into English, winning the International Man Booker Prize, and I love it. I think it is worth all of the praise. To be honest, I can't believe I've not read more by Han Kang yet, given how much I adored this book. And something that not a lot of people know about it, because it's not like part of the marketing campaign or anything, is it's actually inspired by the myth of Daphne and Apollo from Ovid's Metamorphoses. And I think if you've read the book, or once you've read the book and you look up a summary of that myth, or you know that myth, you will instantly be able to see the overlap. You certainly don't need to know the myth to enjoy the book though, but I just think that's like a fascinating piece of background to it. I would definitely class this as feminist literature. it makes some really incredible statements in quite a subtle way using beautiful language, although again I read the English translation, but it comes across beautifully. And it follows a young woman living in South Korea, and she again is pretty much in a loveless marriage. She's treated like his maidservant, and one day she decides to become a vegetarian, and her husband just cannot understand why. Neither can her family. They all just don't know why she's decided to do this, and they find it really difficult. They're constantly trying to feed her meat, and this begins like a steady decline in her health, basically, because she is trying to essentially reclaim ownership of her body, and all the men in her life are trying to stop her from doing that, and it's never narrated from her perspective. So chapter 1 is from her husband's perspective, chapter 2 is from her sister's husband's perspective, and chapter 3 is from her sister's perspective. And it is, like I said, about her trying to reclaim herself in a male-dominated society that constantly obsesses about her body rather than her mind, and it's so beautifully written, and I love it. If that doesn't come across, I love it. Whilst I'm on the topic of Korea, I actually have a book from North Korea to recommend next, and that is The Accusation by Bandy. So this is a collection of short stories written under a pseudonym because the author was and is still living in North Korea when they published this book, and it does not paint North Korea in a positive light. These are realist short stories of everyday life for people living in North Korea, and the kind of hardships that they face and their encounters with the North Korean government and how that impinges on their lives. And it is not a cheerful book by any means. It's very dark, but not in a surreal, unimaginable way, in a this is people's lives kind of way. And I think the short story collection worked as a really effective medium to explore life in North Korea, and I think it's definitely worth checking out. But then we have A Winter's Promise by Christelle Dabo. This is the first in the Mirror Visitors series, which is a young adult fantasy series by the author. And I did think it was interesting when I was making this list how few pieces of sort of genre fiction, as people describe them, are on it. Like, there's not a lot of science fiction or fantasy on this list, and I particularly don't come across a lot of translated fantasy. I find the translated fiction I come across is more often than not classics or literary fiction, which is interesting, but I would love recommendations of more translated fantasy if you have them. However, Winter's Promise is one that I have read and adored. It was only translated into English quite recently, but if you want to read the whole series and can read French, they are also currently available in their original language. It follows our protagonist Ophelia, who is given away in an arranged marriage. It's set in this very magical world where different populations live on different sort of floating citadels, and she's sent to a different citadel, and when she gets there it is a real shock how different these people are and this community is to her own home, and she has to readjust, but at the same time is coming to terms with the fact that she's very much been sent there as a political pawn. So she's kind of keeping an eye out in the background to see what people have planned for her and what she can do to take care of herself in this whole scenario. She does actually have some magical abilities like many people do in this world. Hers specifically is that she can touch items and learn about the previous owner, and she can also travel through mirrors, which is what gives the series the title, The Mirror Visitors. I really need to read book 2 because I loved book 1. I thought it was completely absorbing, a really unique magical fantasy world with a really different protagonist in the sense that this is not actually a romance, and I do think that's rare. As much as I love a romance in my fantasy, I think it is rare to find young adult fantasy, particularly with things like arranged marriages, that don't turn into romances, so that's a little bit of something different if you don't like romances. But last but not least, I thought I would end once again on a short story collection, and specifically of some traditional folk tales, and that is The Turnip Princess and Other Newly Discovered Fairy Tales. This was published by Penguin Classics not that long ago. The original collection is by Franz Xavier von Schonwerth, who collected what I believe were Bavarian folk tales, and this is the collection sort of come back into the limelight, and I was not disappointed by this at all. I love a collection of folktales and traditional fairy tales. I find them really compulsive to read from beginning and end, despite the fact that they're often quite repetitive, and that is just the thing with folktales. There's a lot of princes and princesses and saviours and 3 tasks that need to be completed and talking animals, and yeah, there is a lot of repetition, but I find something quite soothing and enjoyable about that, and it's all the more fun when there are little twists and turns like there was in this collection, which I find to be quite unique. And that's not to say that the other fairy tale collections I've read aren't unique, but there were elements in these fairy tales that I hadn't come across before, which was lovely to read. The fairy tales themselves were originally put together by the author in the 1850s, so again, a piece of 19th century literature that's part of the common trend of that time to collate different communities' fairy tales into sort of like one bind up, shall we say. And again, if you're into this genre of literature, I would highly recommend this collection. But those are my personal top 10 favourite pieces of translated fiction that are currently available in English, although not originally written in English. I would love to hear from you your recommendations for translated fiction, because it's certainly something that I could do with reading more, because I do think it's a very like positive, expansive experience reading translated fiction. So do let me know in the comments down below. But other than that, happy reading, and I'll see you all again soon. Bye guys.